Thank you very much. My name is Victor Odero. I join you from the International Rescue Committee from Nairobi. I work on a project we call Refugees in East Africa, Building Urban Innovations for Livelihoods Development. You will all, I'm sure you're all aware of the cost of living crisis that has affected the world in 2022. I want to draw your attention to the situation in East Africa, particularly in Kenya and in Uganda, where the crisis is having a disproportionate impact on urban poor and refugees in particular. Rising costs of living, marked by rising costs of transport, basic commodities, and food, coupled with exclusion from social protection programs, means that refugees in particular are experiencing a disproportionate impact of this crisis. In Nairobi, which is one of, actually Kenya is one of the countries that is top 10 in terms of experiencing the risks associated with the current cost of living crisis. Inflation is at 10%, food prices have gone up by 50% this year alone. In Kampala, which is still recovering from the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, and where most households in Kampala city are experiencing acute food insecurity, about 51% of households in Kampala report that they are unable to access clean drinking water. Our social reliance index, which is a tool that we use on our project, is telling us that there is rising indebtedness, inability to pay rent. Families are having to cut back on the food that they eat, the number of meals that they have each day. And just to give you an example, 40% of women in Kampala and 34% of women in Nairobi have had to sell household items in order to meet their food needs. And all this is corroborated by evidence that we are collecting from refugees who are having to drop out of our livelihoods initiatives. Our livelihood initiatives aim to help them build skills, grow their businesses, acquire skills that would enable them to become self-reliant. But what they're telling us is that it has become simply too expensive for them to attend these activities. The problem we are facing really is exclusion from social protection mechanisms, national social protection systems. I would like to cite work that has been done by the UNHCR over the last 1 year that has identified that, in fact, despite progressive and inclusive policies and legislation in both countries, refugees are not included in national social protection systems. In Kenya, where it is a constitutional right to be part of social security system, and where only about 25% of the national population has access to social protection. In Uganda, where just about 1% have access to social protection, and most of those projects are up north. What we've had over the last couple of months talking to donors and policymakers is that on one hand, policymakers are willing to include refugees in social protection systems, but they simply do not have the resources. But what we're also hearing from donors is they continue to invest in or put their financing in rural camp-based settlements. So what we are trying to focus attention on is the skewedness of displacement financing when it comes to social protection. And just to give you an example, during the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years, we saw that refugees in rural-based camps and settlements were supported through social protection measures. These measures did not reach urban refugees. And at the core of this, we think, is this assumption that refugees living in cities must be self-reliant because they have access to more economic opportunities and entrepreneurship opportunities. But in fact, that is a paradox. It is precisely because they do not have access to social protection that they cannot take advantage of those opportunities when they arise, especially when there is a shock such as we are experiencing this year. And so we are recommending that donors and host governments focus on ensuring that social protection is accessible to all without discrimination based on refugee status or location of residence. We are also urging governments and donors to work with city authorities in particular and frontline organizations such as ourselves to ensure that social protection services are made available to urban refugees. And lastly, to governments and private sector and host governments in particular to ensure that barriers to financial inclusion are lifted, because it is through mobile money and banking services that social protection benefits can be made available. Thank you very much. More analysis is in a report that we can share with you. Thank you.